Hello, Mike here, coming to you from the Art House in Sheffield. In this episode, I'm going to be running through how to make a simple pinch pot form out of £1 or 450 grams of clay. So a pinch pot is about the simplest way of forming clay. Once you get the hang of it, there's an awful lot of versatility to the forms you can make using a pinch pot. At its simplest, a pinch pot can just be made with your hands and the clay you're working with, but one or two other bits and bobs you may need are a plastic tub with some water in it. You may need a wooden paddle and a turntable or banding wheel can also come in handy, so I'll be demonstrating the possible uses for those as we go along. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I have my pound of clay here. If you don't have scales to hand, it's roughly the same size as your fist, or maybe a little bit smaller than your fist. What you don't want to do when it comes to making a pinch pot is start out with too much clay, because as we open this form out, it's going to get a lot bigger than it is here. So if you have much more than this to start with, it can get very unwieldy and difficult to keep under control. So especially if it's your first time having a go at making a pinch pot, £1, 450 grams is a good place to start. So to begin, I'm just patting this between my palms to get it as smooth and round as possible. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but something more or less like this will be a good place to start out. So I'm beginning by cupping it in my right palm, and I'm going to be using my left thumb first of all to open it out. So cupping the ball in my right hand, and I'm just going to push down into it with my left thumb. So I'm rotating it as I do this, and I'm just working down with that thumb, aiming for a depth of about 1 centimetre or so of clay in the bottom here. So we don't want to leave it too thick down in the bottom. We also don't want to push all the way through with our thumb until it's poking out of the far side. So at this early stage, if in doubt, it's better to leave it a touch on the thicker side rather than going too far through. So I've worked down into it with my thumb. If you are unsure, you can just sort of rest the clay like so, check the depth that your thumb has gone into, and then hold it next to it. And that can be a useful way of just identifying how far down your thumb has gone and how much clay you have left in there. So once we've kind of drilled this fairly narrow hole into the clay, it's then going to be a case of rotating the piece and just gently opening it out between my fingertips on the outside of the clay and my thumb on the inside. So we're just pinching the clay between our fingers and thumb like this. We're starting out opening it out mostly down at this bottom point here, and then once we've thinned that out, we're going to start working our way up towards the opening. So with pinch pots, it can be very easy for the rim here to flare outwards and for the whole thing to get much wider and much more baggy than we want it to be. So that's part of the reason why we're focusing to start with on just opening out that clay down below. And a lot of it is just about getting a feel and a sense of that clay between your fingers and thumb, and just learning to identify how thick it is. So it's just one of those things that comes with practice and experience and time spent doing it. So that now feels suitably thinned out to me, so I'm now going to start working my way up. So the key is really in just keeping up with that rotation. So we're just doing a little bit of squeezing each time between our finger and thumb. And it's all about the repetition and keeping it rotating. So to start with, it's going to be quite a crude and very obviously hand-formed shape. So So the initial opening stages and thinning the clay out are relatively quick, and then the more time-consuming part will come when we're refining the form. So at this first stage, we're just focusing on thinning the clay out, aiming for a nice even consistency throughout the whole piece. What we don't want are any thick areas and thin areas. Ideally, we want the whole thickness to be as uniform as we can get it. And now, so I'm going to alternate from using my fingers and thumb, and I'm just going to push using my fingers on the inside, just into that inside corner a bit more, into the palm of my right hand. And I'm now starting to kind of scoop and run my fingers around the surface on the inside, just to round out into this bottom corner here. So we're starting to get the basic shape. So the clay is now roughly a ½ centimetre in thickness, pretty much throughout. There will be plenty of opportunity for further refining of the piece as we go along. So a few things you'll want to do at this stage are, if the clay is starting to crack at all, so because we've been exerting quite a lot of pressure on the clay and we've been deforming it quite a bit, chances are the rim in particular can start to get a bit of a cracking effect. And that's where just using the water that we have to hand here, just a fingertip or so, and running back and forth over any surfaces that are starting to crack like this, just to reincorporate them into themselves. So at this stage, you really don't want to be using much water at all. The last thing you want is to end up with a waterlogged, soggy lump of clay, and for your hands to be covered in water and for the whole thing to start slipping around and falling apart. So just a fingertip at a time is plenty, and making sure that's fully incorporated into the surface before moving on to more water. If you want to level the rim of your pot out, a nifty way of doing that is just to pop it down onto your surface and just give it a few gentle pats, and that will then leave you with a more or less perfectly level rim, which can then be just tidied up further by running a thumb along those corners. Pinch pots lend themselves quite nicely to organic ovoid round forms like this. You can often find on a pinch pot a rounded bottom like this. Alternatively, if you wanted a flat base to your pinch pot, so something more like a mug kind of shape or something that's a bit more freestanding, that's where using a banding wheel can come into play. So in a similar way to what we did with the rim, where we gently landed the rim onto the surface to flatten the rim off, we can do the same thing with the base of the piece. So just gently and repeatedly tapping it down onto this banding wheel. And we are finding that before long, our pinch pot has got a flat base. And then if you want to, you can then work into that corner. So I'm gently pushing outwards on the inside of the piece and inwards on the outside, just to, rather than having a smooth curving piece, we're just producing something with more of a flat base and straighter sides. You can close the form back in on itself a bit, so just by gently squeezing it back in on itself and repeatedly rotating it like so. So you don't want to squeeze it too much with each go, or you risk the whole thing kind of folding in on itself. So just gently squeezing it, and again, it's all about that repetition, rotating it, keeping it moving. In terms of further refining the surface on the outside, that's where your wooden paddle can come into play. So just gently supporting the inside with, I'm using my left hand, and again just working my way around. So at the moment, this clay is still quite soft and there's a lot of give to it. So the thing to do at this stage would be to leave it to stiffen up for the further refinement. So at this stage, we're really just aiming for the basic shape and aiming to thin the clay out sufficiently. But you hopefully get the idea that a form like this can form the basis for a lot of further work. You could put another pinch pot inverted on top of this one to make an enclosed form, which can then be further worked with to produce things like bottles and boxes. You can add coils and slabs of clay onto this, so the pinch pot can form the base of a piece, which can then be worked upon further. So that's just the basics of opening a piece of clay out using the pinching technique. So in future videos we'll look at expanding on this further, incorporating coils and slabs, adding them to the basic pinch pot base that we have here. So there's a lot of versatility to this once you get the hang of the basic pinch pot form. So this is something worth spending a bit of time practicing, getting the hang of the basics, and then we'll look a bit further later on at refining these further. So I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.